Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Scrambling. I'm the Director of Chicago Studies and Experiential Learning in the college. What that means is that I get to work with Dean Boyer and the rest of the team, college administration, to think about the ways that the college intersects with the city. Chicago Studies has actually been around for quite a long time, although it wasn't brought into the college as a college office until a few years ago. Long before the office existed, however, the journal Chicago Studies existed. And every year since 2007, Chicago Studies has anthologized some of the best undergraduate research about the city. A couple of years ago, we realized that it would be a really great thing if we took advantage of the genius of the authors whose work was published in this volume every year and invited them to talk to us a little bit about the work that they had done, why they chose to do it, and where they've gone since. That's what this session is about. We hope that listening to the stories of 4 of the contributors to our number 10 volume, the 2019 volume, available in print in our offices and available online at our website. Tess, can you drop that link into the chat if you would? Thank you. We hope that a chance to converse with them and ask them questions and hear about what led them to do the work that they did. We hope that that will serve to inspire you, maybe answer some questions, or help you to think through or resolve some challenges that you're experiencing with your own projects. In addition to that, of course, Chicago Studies itself continues to be available. Our offices are now located at 1155 East 60th Street. That's the old Harris School of Public Policy building, located at the corner of 60th Street and Woodlawn. We would love to meet with you there anytime, and we have tended to hold kind of open research sessions on Friday afternoons. With the pandemic, those are not quite so open, but we're always happy to talk to anyone who needs help thinking about a Chicago-based project. As we kick off, I want to say special thanks to Tess Conway, who's our programming coordinator, who helped to organize all of this event and who will be, I'm sure, providing us with all kinds of helpful links as we make our way through. Is that Hannah joining? Hi, Hannah. Good to see you. Hannah is another one of our distinguished authors, but we're not going to talk about Hannah's work at all because it's from the previous volume. Okay, very good. Well, it would be great if we could have our presenters just say a few words. Breck, you were the first to log in, so can we just hear a little bit about who you are and tell us a little bit maybe about your project, and then you can popcorn it to one of the other authors, please.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Brent Radulovic. I graduated in 2019, but I still live here in the city. I was a history and religious studies major, which I think comes through in my BA thesis, which I'll talk about in a second. But for the past 3 years, I've been working at the American Bar Foundation as an editorial coordinator for an academic journal, and also as a program coordinator for a summer undergraduate research fellowship. I feel like writing my BA really prepared me for both of those opportunities. But my BA thesis is called Chicago at the End of Time, Millennial Imaginings in the World's Fair City. And essentially, I looked at Chicago in the year 1893, which was the year of the World's Fair, which you may or may not have heard of. It took place actually mostly on the Midway, so in the area we now know as Hyde Park and Washington Park today. And I looked at how Chicagoans saw the World's Fair as a sign of apocalypse, both in a positive way, which is how 19th century Christians tended to view the apocalypse, that it would be a really joyous moment, that humankind had reached its perfect end, and that Jesus Christ would come back and reign over earth for 1,000 years of perfect moral harmony. But also how they saw the events after the World's Fair, both an economic recession, the assassination of Mayor Carter Harrison, and the eventual destruction of the fairgrounds itself as sign of a more negative apocalypse, kind of representative of what modern evangelical Christians tend to believe in today, which bad things are going to happen. There'll be a lot of war, plague, and pestilence as a sign of God's displeasure with humankind. So 2 different strains of apocalypticism were kind of waging war in the Christian consciousness at the time. And I thought that the World's Fair was an excellent way to examine how everyday people and everyday pastors kind of looked at these issues. And so I will popcorn to Olivia.
Hi everyone, my name is Olivia, also class of 2019. I was a double major in sociology and environmental and urban studies, so very embedded in the Chicago studies world. I did one of the Calumet quarters, which I think has since been rebranded as Chicago Studies Quarter. We'll definitely give it another plug. It was a really great experience, and I think the program changes every year, but when we did it, it had a huge focus on urban planning, which was an interest that sort of crossed all of my coursework and majors and theses. So I ended up writing about Chicago's Chinatown neighborhood, looking at the built environment and architecture through the lens of boundary making and sort of identity formation at the level of the individual and at the level of the community. So that really laid the foundation for future roles at the Metropolitan Planning Council, working as a marketing consultant for them. And then I eventually ended up at SOM, which is an architecture firm based in Chicago, as well as a few offices and other places. And I managed communications for them. So that background in research and writing has helped me out a lot. And I'm currently applying to grad programs in urban planning. So very grateful to UChicago and Chicago Studies for embedding an interest very early on in urban planning and in the built environment. And I'll toss it over to Nora.
Hi everyone, my name's Nora and I also graduated in 2019. I majored in comparative human development. And for my thesis, I focused on the wave of school closings in 2013 in Chicago. Of the 44 buildings closed in 2013, 30 of those buildings still remain vacant or were vacant at the time of writing. And I think what inspired me to kind of delve deeper into the citywide issue is I did a program called Jumpstart in college where undergrads are employed to go and provide preschool programming twice a week in schools across Chicago. And so I did that, and there was one quarter where I was supposed to go to Fisk, a school called Fisk, and I tried to go. I used Google Maps to get there. I was in Woodlawn. It was really close to campus, but I accidentally went to the wrong Fisk. It was its old building because a lot of these waves of school closures have caused these crazy domino effects of schools moving from one building to another and then ending up in school buildings that don't bear their name on the front door. So I got very, very confused. And that inspired me to look further into the issue. And it also answered a lot of questions that I had about why there were all these empty, vacant buildings around the city, especially on the south and west side. So after graduating in 2019, I went and got a master's in teaching. And for the past 2 years, I've been a preschool teacher on the southwest side of the city in Brighton Park at a neighborhood school called Columbia Explorers Academy. And I think that Chicago studies and my BA thesis in particular really helped me contextualize my work and understand where I am and understand the relationship between communities and their schools, because there's a really strong connection between their school community, the people who live there, and their schools. And with that, there's been a really big break in trust between the district and between these school communities, because in 2013 and in many previous waves of school closures, schools have been closed in communities that have already experienced a lot of disinvestment from the city. And so seeing that and how that affects community members' relationships with their government, with their city, and with their school community has been really interesting. Popcorn, I think our last author here is Keisha.
Hey everyone, I hope you guys can hear me. It's a little loud where I'm at. My name is Keisha. I also graduated in 2019, and I studied art history in the college, and I wrote my thesis on Kerry James Marshall and his mural called Rushmore, which is on the Chicago Cultural Center. on the back wall. And it was really interesting for me to get to meet Harry James Marshall, the other muralist, and both of them worked on the project. Also interface with people in DCASE, the Department of Culture and something. Gosh, it's been so long, I forgot what DCASE even stands for, but here we are. Amazing that you can like forget about what your thesis was written about and time passes. Anyways, I probably should have reviewed it. Sorry. But it was a great experience. Yeah, or you can read it and learn for yourself. I think Chris has some copies and it's online. But it was a really great experience for me to learn more about the city, learn more about city politics and what exactly goes into creating a mural, how are the artists and the mayor and the museums involved in producing a particular type of work. And it was a really enlightening process. I feel like I learned a lot, and that knowledge and the skill set is applicable to me today. Right now, I'm in law school at Berkeley, and I'm specifically interested in NFTs and crypto law. And so you might be thinking, like, what is the relationship there? Fair. The relationship is that like NFTs are allowing artists to monetize their work, and and move into like a new form of economy called a creator economy. And so as I'm studying NFTs, working in that ecosystem, I find myself writing pieces about like NFTs and their historical context and who is producing it and what are the art worlds that are kind of at work in distributing and sharing this new form of art, and who is consuming it and how has the type of public changed in this new medium. And so I think the ties there are pretty close. I love that my thesis taught me how to think critically about different artworks and the producers, and gain the confidence, I guess, to ask artists certain questions that I probably wouldn't have otherwise. So yeah, I'm excited to be here talking with you guys.
Both Keisha and Nora did a great job of setting up the next thing I'd love to hear you all speak about a little bit. Nora, I had never heard that origin story that in some ways it was getting lost that led to you. I've had some similar experience doing work on CPS schools and being incredibly confused. I was trying to map them onto various CPS campuses and got hopelessly lost because they seemed to be moving, and that seemed impossible. And then I realized that schools weren't building bound, but that had never occurred to me, not being a Chicago native originally. I would love to hear about the origin stories of each of your projects. Sort of, had you done other work that was looking at Chicago before? Were there other experiences early in your college years that really cued you into a particular question or a particular neighborhood? How did you get on the path that eventually led to writing these pieces? And Nora, do you mind if I pick on you, since you kind of started us in that direction already?
I think that I shared my kind of like aha inspiration story, but I think I grew up in the suburbs and then went to school in the city and have lived there except for the 1 year I spent in grad school the entire time, my whole life. But I grew up in the suburbs, and so I didn't know exactly how Chicago public schools worked. And I felt like if I was going to be a teacher there, and if I wanted to commit to teaching in the city, I needed to learn a little bit more about kind of the murky history there, and to understand more about the relationship between community members and their schools. And I spent time working in schools throughout my undergraduate experience, through the neighborhood schools program and through Jumpstart. And so yeah, that's kind of how I got there. Should I pop more?
Yeah, I think at this point we can open it up. How about some of the others? Origin stories, where your superpowers came from?
I can go next. I think it was sort of I didn't have as cool of an origin story as Nora, but I did take a class, I think it was my second or third year, on gentrification, and a lot of the modules we did in that quarter were focused at the scale of the neighborhood. So we looked at many different neighborhoods across Chicago. I'm half Chinese, but grew up in the US, so I've always sort of taken an interest in the Chinese population in the US, and particularly Chinatowns. I'm from Washington, DC, and our Chinatown is super gentrified. There's, a few Chinese restaurants left, but then it's Starbucks and Urban Outfitters. So there's not really a strong sense of identity left. Whereas Chicago's Chinatown has always been really unique to me in the sense that it's maintained a lot of integrity in terms of small businesses are there. You can tell a lot of the residents are, local, of Asian descent, speak Mandarin in the streets or Cantonese. And I started getting really interested in kind of the differences in Chinatowns across the country, but obviously Chicago's in our backyard. So instead of trying to do an analysis of like every Chinatown ever in the US, I really focused in on Chicago. And I think a pro tip for anyone trying to figure out where they want to focus their research is Chinatown was, one train ride away. So that was definitely a factor for me when it came to data collection, was just the proximity and the availability of like that space and the people who were generous enough to speak with me. It made it a lot easier.
I guess I can go next. My project came out of my Chicago Studies quarter, and the theme of my Chicago Studies quarter was housing in Chicago. So we did an English class, reading lots of literature about housing in Chicago, a narrative writing class about Chicago, and then also a class on Black elderly memory in Chicago, which tied a lot into narratives of people who grew up and lived in public housing before the destruction of Cabrini Green. So with all these kind of things floating around, I ended up writing a paper for that English class for Adrienne Brown on different utopian communities in Chicago at the time, or different visions of utopian communities. So I wrote about Pullman, which is to the south of Hyde Park, which is kind of a capitalist utopia in a really bizarre way. It was a new spin on the company town, where George Pullman had complete moral control over what was available to residents, and even controlled the fact that the higher up you were in the company, the more ornate your house would be. But other than that, all the houses are like these really beautiful townhomes, all next to each other. So that's where it came from. And I got introduced to this really interesting book called If Christ Came to Chicago, which is really the main part of my thesis, written by a British journalist named William T. Stead. So he came to Chicago on the last day of the World's Fair. And whereas a lot of the city was, kind of still riding this high of the World's Fair, which they felt like had put them on the map. They were comparable to Paris and better than New York, was kind of the feeling in the city. He saw Chicago as this like moral wasteland full of gambling dens and brothels. And in addition to that, he also took a lot of offense to how Chicago treated its poor and its laboring people. So he wrote this book, If Christ Came to Chicago. And the punchline is, if Christ came to Chicago, he would not be very happy. And so I decided to write a paper about that book for a graduate level religious studies class at the Div School. And it didn't go well. It was like the worst grade I ever got on a paper. And after that, I was like, okay, I didn't do justice to this idea, this concept. How can I make it better the second time around? Like, how can I do a better job? And so that's how my thesis kind of came about. And in addition to that, William Stead was a British journalist, and all of his papers are in the UK. So I was like, okay, how can I do research in Chicago and also get a trip to Europe? And so I applied for these grants to do research in the UK to study this journalist. Yeah, so I was, there's a lot more money available to go abroad and do research than there is to do research staying in Chicago. So I tried to strategize a little bit so I could figure out how I could do a project that satisfied both my majors and would also pay me to do research over the summer. So also it was really fun. I just couldn't shut up about the World's Fair for like the next several years. I think it finally has calmed down. I finally have gotten it out of my system. But
that's awesome. That sounds like such a cool path to coming to your topic. For me, I was shooting in the dark a fair bit. I knew I wanted to write about public art because I was interested in I think public art opens up a lot of different avenues for inquiry. It's like, who is the public? What is the architecture of the building? What neighborhood are you working in? What relationship does the artist have to the city that is being produced? And we're thinking about like art in a very material way, embedded within a community. So that's kind of how I started thinking about public art. Conveniently, the year that I was writing my thesis was also the year of public art put on by the city of Chicago. So I was like, that's great. Like there are going to be 50 different wards, each with a different mural that's going to be created. Like maybe I'll do some sort of like aggregate analysis of the relationships between each mural, the artist, and their location, and see if there are any like broad city level themes that are coming out. I was specifically interested in like the socioeconomic status and race of the artist and their relationship to like the neighborhood that they're working in. And that was initially my angle. And I took that to my professor, who was my advisor, Professor Pop, who's an art history professor, but also in the committee on social thought. And I was like, what do you think? And he's like, I quite frankly think that like the comparison between two art pieces, or like, he's like, I think aggregate is too much. And if you were to just pick, and I was like, maybe if I pick two neighborhoods and did a comparison, he's like, I think a comparison is too much. Like, I don't think you're going to be able to dive deeply into the ideas that you want to through the use of comparison. Like, why don't we think a little bit more deeply on this? So I started looking up like public art in Chicago, and then like a headline was Carrie James Marshall is now going to be working on the Chicago Cultural Center. And I was like, yes, like what a convenient and perfect topic. It hasn't been written about yet. There's very little on Carrie James Marshall, but it was right after he had made like a grand US tour with his exhibition that was in LACMA, in the MCA, and in New York. And I was like, this is perfect. Cool. Like, let's do something with this. And we just kind of ran with it in that sense. So I would say like fate was more on my side than anything else. I don't think that I was like critically thinking too hard, but I think topics can just come out of different avenues that you just really don't expect. So I think when you're doing research, it's like important to just like keep your eyes open and understand like what sort of things you personally gravitate towards, and then just like continuing to push and lean in that direction, and hopefully like the universe will align, and then you'll just like have this epiphany moment, and then you'll be good to go.
I'm so grateful that all four of your stories are really different, to be honest. Keisha said it way better than I could. I think that the process whereby people find their questions and the things that kind of suck them in can be really different. I was kind of laughing a few minutes ago at like the two pro tips that we got that were completely contradictory to one another. One, take the shortest possible train ride to do your research, and the other, use your research as an excuse to go to an entirely different continent. Both of those can coexist as recommendations, and both of them are really great tips. I kind of love them both. As you got going, each of you, obviously you all kind of settled in on a particular method or a particular approach, and you found sources. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about sort of those mechanics. What did your research process look like? What sources did you use? And maybe even more importantly, who helped you? Who was kind of most useful to you as you were kind of navigating your research process?
I can start with this one. Oh, Breck, do you want to go ahead? I don't want
So
to
you
take
can
it
go first.
Oh,
Go
okay.
first.
So in terms of like my research and what sources, within the discipline of art history, I was writing on a piece of artwork that had not ever been written about. And there was also very little written about Carrie James Marshall at that time. The museum had made their there was an exhibition catalog, and for like his most recent like US tour, and then there were 2 older museum catalogs. So that was like all I had. And so I turned to like relatively unconventional sources for an art history paper, because I was thinking about like the city and the work of public art. I used FOIA to request information from the city of Chicago, and that turned out to be like incredibly fruitful. They can select and like selectively choose what they're giving you, so they're not going to give you 100% of their information, which is annoying, but it do be like that in Chicago. So I was able to get like a lot of legal contracts between like the city and the different artists that I was able to leverage for my paper. In addition to that, I was looking at the nonprofit that had technically commissioned the work. So I was going through like their 501c3 papers to understand like what their organizational structure looked like, what their mission was, what their budget was, what their sources of funding were. In addition to that, I was turning to newspaper articles and press releases written about the work of art. And it was through that I was able to get quotes from different political leaders in the city of Chicago. And then finally, through the university, we had some professors who knew Carrie directly. And so it was awesome. I was able to speak with him on a personal level, like in a phone call, and he was really rad. And so I feel like the university was like tremendously helpful in connecting me with him and pointing me in the right direction. I used the reg and their books on Carrie James Marshall, and then also just like aggressive Googling. So a smattering of sources, and combing through them all, I think was just like the struggle and figuring out what my argument was going to be. But yeah, that was my journey.
So mine is kind of the opposite. I used very traditional primary sources as a history paper. So like I said, I went to Europe, and for that I looked through William T. Stead, the journalist's papers. So I spent a lot of time in the archives over there, reading his work, reading his other stuff, reading his personal letters to people to kind of get a sense of what he was thinking about behind the scenes, because he was also a very savvy shock journalist. So what he writes, you can't take at face value necessarily. So I was trying to get a sense of that. And then back in Chicago, I spent a lot of time at the Newberry in the Chicago Historical Museum, reading lots of newspapers and first-person accounts, things like that. I got lucky and found a collection of sermons related to the World's Fair, which obviously for my paper was really helpful. But beyond that, I spent a lot of time using the library's access to different databases for historical publications. So I spent a lot of time with the Chicago Tribune's archives online, which is all searchable. And then also with like Hoffy Trust and stuff, a lot of these sources had been digitized so that like every single sentence is word searchable, which was really helpful for my project. So I did a lot of stringing together different keywords like apocalypse Chicago or like millennium Chicago and seeing what came up. So the main thing was that there was just so much information. How did I get it down to what was useful and what was representative? Because when you're searching through millions, if not billions of words, you can find examples for almost anything you want to. So how do you prove that this is an example of a broader trend and not just like one crackpot looking for, like one crackpot saying something dramatic? So that was kind of the struggle. I had like an extra hard drive of newspapers saved for a while, and just going through and like then rereading and making sense of the themes that came up and came up most frequently. So yeah, if anyone wants to talk about archives, particularly archives in Chicago, I'd love to do that. I'll go with you, make a day of it. But I found it really enjoyable. It was like doing a treasure hunt every time.
I was pretty lucky because I had taken so many urban planning and architecture focus courses. I had a lot of essentially literature reviews to start from based on like professors' research and conversations with professors. So I think approach was, I always knew I wanted to do interviews with both designers or architects who had worked in Chinatown, as well as local community leaders or community members. But I wanted to supplement that with some sort of visual analysis or like recording of the built environment, because so much of it was, based on design, experience of space. And I remember reading work from Kevin Lynch, who was a really fascinating geographer and like urban theorist, who really spearheaded this idea about mental mapping or cognitive mapping, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. I think the famous example of that is that New Yorker cover that's like how New Yorkers perceive of the United States, and it's like New York and then a mess of nothing and then California. So I thought this means of kind of like speaking to people and trying to get a sense of their understanding of space and how they relate to space was really fascinating. And sort of supplementing literature, which I found through JSTOR and all the usual suspects. And interviews, I also did these mental maps with all of my, or most of my research participants, the ones who did want to do it. And I think it was a really interesting approach in two ways. One, because not many people really knew what a mental map was when we started the conversation. And I think that lent itself well to very like firsthand, like off the cuff impressions of Chinatown and how people navigated through that space or conceived of space, as opposed to someone who's more familiar with the subject and might like perfectly recreate a map of Chinatown or like perfectly draw their route to work. And also because I think it just helped visualize the space better. It's one thing to talk about architecture or something that is like 3D, and it's another thing to see how people perceive of it through illustration or through mental mapping. So that was a big piece of my thesis, and is actually what I hope to study too in grad school. So I've never really let this go, but that sort of study of placemaking was probably the most fascinating part of my research, and definitely like the most exciting and engaging aspect of my interviews with people. Like they really came alive when they had to draw space for me and kind of explain their reasoning while they were doing it.
I had a pretty similar experience to Keisha. A lot of the things you said, I was like, wow, yeah, that resonates with me. I feel like in terms of zeroing in on literature, I really leaned into a lot of the UChicago faculty that I interacted with in my undergrad experience. So Sarah Race DeLinga, who used to teach some undergraduate classes at the Urban Education Institute on campus, UEI. She was really helpful. I used a lot of sources that I read in her class. I also used some of her kind of more anecdotal experiences. So in her role, she also used to run the UChicago charter schools. And she, at one point, was renting one of the closed school buildings for the charter school. And at one point it came up for sale and she tried to buy it for the charter school. And it was so difficult. There were so many bureaucratic obstacles, so much miscommunication in repurposing the building. It was really interesting to hear about her experience there, almost as like a community community member and stakeholder with the school, and then also her academic take on it. I also took some classes with Emily Talon. I used kind of an urbanist lens to assess how the buildings were being repurposed. So I had a lot of kind of like seminal urbanist works from hers. And then, thanks, Olivia. And then Dr. Eve Ewing at SSA, she wrote a book that was actually released the year I wrote my thesis, called Ghosts in the Schoolyard, which was very literally about the school closings in 2013. And so that was really helpful to kind of ground myself in literature. But that being said, there was not a lot written about school closings at that time. It's pretty tight-lipped, and a lot of the information that I got was from aggressive Googling and newspaper articles. And then also interviewing the authors of the newspaper articles who introduced me to more people who I could interview. I used a snowball sampling method to kind of keep getting connected with people who were involved in different aspects of the school closures and repurposing. So yeah, aggressive Googling and UChicago faculty.
Aggressive Googling may be, I don't know, a t-shirt that's coming out of Chicago Studies sometime really soon. I feel like that phrase has emerged clearly. Somebody take a note and remind me. Chrissy Hartman just left. I'm so sad, but so helpful. A lot of you kind of alluded to obstacles that you encountered in doing your work and the ways that you overcame those. I'm actually really interested to hear anything that came out of your research that kind of surprised you. Maybe something that changed the way you think about the city, or if nothing else did that, I'd be curious to hear something that really confirmed something you always kind of thought you knew in your research process and sort of all that came out of it.
I can go. I think this was both surprising and confirming, or affirming, I guess, is talking to people who had successfully bought buildings from Chicago and learning their story of how they successfully bought them. I know that, everyone says Chicago is a huge political machine and that the mayor runs the show, but I think there was always a part of me that thought, like, it's education, for the children and for the community, and that there was like a more personal aspect to things, or I don't know, something that like supported communities and had kind of like a humanitarian essence to it. But talking to people who had successfully bought buildings, the most successful stories I heard, the mayor's hand was in there. Like one building in Bronzeville that was repurposed is now the Union Hall for the I think like the plumbers of Chicago. And the only reason they were able to buy that building is because Johnson & Johnson wanted to buy their building in a more attractive location downtown. So the mayor helped facilitate the purchase of this building farther south. And like, that's why it was successful. So surprising, but also confirming.
I think I also didn't have, I know maybe it was a surprise, and the surprise is that history truly is a cycle. People are always saying that Chicago is the worst it's ever been and is like hell on earth. And that language has been present since practically the founding of the city. It was a very swampy place in the 1830s, and from to the fire in 1871 to the World's Fair. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that shirt. Through like the Chicago Black Sox scandal and the rise of machine politics to like 1968 and the DNC riots. I mean, it's just continual. That I think all cities have this, but Chicago in particular gets described in a certain way, both in local and national media, in a way that a lot of that is just so much more in some cities. But in addition to that, there's also this sense of like someone's going to come save Chicago. So obviously by time period, it was like Jesus Christ. And then, but I saw a lot of similarities there with how people talked about Obama in 2008. And so, you'll also sometimes still see t-shirts around that say like, our hope, our savior, or things like that with like Obama's face. Less so now. This was more present in like, 2017, 2018 than it is now. But that there's just like this push and pull of Chicago as like the example of what happens to a city of sin, and then also like a positive example, like with all this hope. Like Chicago is really special for a lot of reasons to do with like everyone else's projects, a lot about urban planning and stuff. But that was what I thought was surprising. I was like, okay, yeah, nothing changes.
I think this is definitely like I guess I went into my research really wanting to do like a super design focused paper that was really in the weeds with like architectural analysis and like design jargon and a lot of stuff that I think most people, one, don't care about, two, don't necessarily have like experience learning about or talking about, and or three, which I think is like pretty common, like maybe you don't think about on a day-to-day basis. I found through a lot of my interviews that like the built environment as a word, not a lot of people know what that means. They don't see something and say like, oh, that's contemporary architecture designed by, a Chinese person who lives in our neighborhood versus, a pagoda style church that was built by a Swedish guy in like the 1800s or whatever. So for me, it was really interesting to learn about one, kind of like the history and I guess the bias that I myself had about the value of certain architectural structures or the perceived value of the structures versus how residents actually use these spaces and the value it brought to them, either from a cultural standpoint, like this, who cares if this pagoda was designed by a Swedish guy? Like it reminds me of home and it reminds me that this is Chinatown. And it also like signals to outsiders that this is a place where they can come and experience our culture and spend money and spend time. So that was like a personal realization of mine about kind of the value and also potentially some of the harmful, effects of designing without thought or close collaboration with the community. And now that I work at a design firm, I find it really interesting to kind of listen in and be a fly on the wall for their own community engagement processes. And I've actually heard a lot of design firms, urban planning firms shift to this word called community empowerment instead of community engagement. So I think, long story short, it definitely got me really interested in how designers and architects and planners engage with people who use these spaces every day, but may not necessarily have the language or the history or the know-how to engage with it in a more like meaningful way that will translate to zoning changes or policy changes. Or, if you say one thing, it'll give you a church. If you say another, you'll get, fancy lofts. So I think like kind of bridging the gap, I guess, between super heady like design stuff, which is what I was really interested in going into this, and things that are more resonating with a broad community and with someone who doesn't care about architecture, was really, really interesting for me. And actually encouraged me to not go be an architecture master's applicant, but to go into urban planning. Not that I have anything against architecture, but I think overall the thesis really like gave me a lot of joy and excitement to work with people outside of design and to learn from them.
That was awesome. So I guess that leads me. And we're talking about like what we found surprising, right? Or interesting. Okay. I guess like what I found surprising was, but also like not that surprising when I like thought a little bit longer about it, was I literally thought that Carrie James Marshall was the one like standing up on some sort of ladder, like painting this ginormous mural on the Chicago Cultural Center. And then I found out that he had a muralist, and the only thing that he had actually done was like design the mural on like a piece of cardboard in an afternoon. And then he donated that to the city. And so when I like first heard that, I was like, this is so crazy. Like the newspapers have been like deceiving me for so long. Like what a misnomer to be calling it like Carrie James Marshall's mural when he literally wasn't there. And then I came to find out that like he had hired this other artist. The other artist was like white, but then they never said anything about him. And he was just like behind the scenes contributing to the work. And like he was paid in a very different way than Carrie was. His talent wasn't valued in the same way. And initially I was like, this is crazy. But then I came around and I was like, of course, like the city wants to commemorate like this Black artist to like show that they're so like racially inclusive and so open-minded and trying to do like amazing good things. But then it like kind of made sense that they were like capitalizing off of his fame and his race. And like Carrie also felt like that after I like had conversations with him. And yes, so that was very interesting and surprising to play out. I just felt like I was like on a roller coaster of like, oh my God, who made it? Like, what is the media trying to tell me? Like, this is so classic of Chicago. And so that was definitely like a journey. Honestly, yeah, somebody needs to do the special and it's not going to be me. Somebody else can spearhead that. Another thing they may not tell you is that like you can kind of get tired of your topic. I digress.
I think anyone who's done research knows that it's pretty easy to get tired of your topic. That's another pro tip. Pick a topic that you think you're going to get tired of just after you get over the hill with the paper so that you can at least get the thing done. Yeah, there's a PhD thesis pile of research piled off somewhere that I just got. Yeah, anyway. We are nearing the end of our time, and I want to make sure that I've been super explicit with anybody else who's listening. If you have a question that you'd like to ask our authors, one that you'd like to put into the chat, if you'd like to turn on your camera and or your audio and ask, this is, you've got them. They're captive here for another 10 minutes. It's a wonderful opportunity to ask the authors of 4 incredibly successful BA papers about their process, about their work, about their inspiration, anything else that catches your fancy. Their Netflix specials.
Is there anyone even there? Hello.
We often wonder the same thing. All right. Well, let me put out just a very, very generic question, a very generic question to the group, which is, what advice would you offer? Having been through this research arc yourselves, perspective of, a couple of years distance, 3 years or so distance from the project, as well as, there you go, as well as having had the chance to kind of revisit your papers in order to edit them down a little bit for the volume. Any advice that you would give? I think we've heard a few good pro tips along the way, but if there's anything else that you want to offer for posterity, that would be amazing.
Do it. I didn't have to write a thesis for my major, but it sounded like it would be kind of a cool experience and something to throw myself into. And to Keisha's point, like it can be kind of tiresome and a little bit exhausting, but but it's good. I met so many cool people. Like one of the people I interviewed was kind of like an obscure, at one point he was running for alder person of his ward, but now he's on the board of Chicago, on the Board of Education. And so I like get emails from him now from the board. You know, it's mostly about paychecks and stuff, but it's fun. You make connections that you wouldn't think that you would have otherwise.
I would say related to that, I think most majors at the university now it's an option as opposed to a requirement to do a thesis. And so remember that you're doing it because you want to. You know, it can be pretty tough and pretty bleak at times if you're treating it like you would another school paper, I think. You know, this isn't like a final paper that you have to do just to get it done and get the grades. This is something you should do because you're enjoying it and you wanted to try research. So yeah, going to England helps, but then there's the 9 months after when you're in Chicago and you have to go to the Newberry and it's 2 degrees outside. And yeah, so I know, I just make sure to have fun with it and definitely team up with your friends. If that's like getting a reg room and writing together or editing each other's work. Lots of people are in the same boat, and that it's something that, yeah, you can always be proud of having to do or having done. You know, I'm not going back into academia like I thought I would. I'm going to law school instead, but I feel like I, you know, was able to do this, you know, kind of academic intellectual achievement at the end of my college career that I won't ever get to do again. And that was really special.
I don't know if Anna has a question, but I was just going to quickly say, if you do think you're going to go to grad school, or if you're going to do any kind of job related to writing or research, having like a writing sample of this length and like depth and caliber will take you really far. It's better than trying to like find a paper you wrote 3rd year that you got an A on. So that's my plug for writing a thesis.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, I'll bite with the audience question. So I had a question just kind of around faculty mentorship, I guess, and specifically thinking about Chicago, like in the context of Chicago studies. I'm wondering if any of you guys ran into questions, or if you have like advice in choosing a faculty mentor, if they should know something about Chicago. Just because I'm starting to think about, you know, who I might want to ask for faculty mentorship, being a 3rd year now. And I guess I don't really know how to start approaching that question.
I recommend getting on it as early as you can. A lot of professors will hit their quota early on and not be able to take you on, no matter how interesting your research sounds, which was something I definitely experienced like fall of senior year. And I was like, oh my God, who's going to be my thesis advisor? I was a double major, so I think I would definitely recommend trying to find a professor who not only studies and teaches something you're interested in that has some kind of crossover with your thesis, but who also knows you well as a writer and as a student. If that's not possible, I actually kind of did it both ways. I worked with Emily Talon, who I know Nora shouted out earlier, who's great for anything built environment related. And then I also found a professor in poli-sci who had never taken a class in before, but some of his research and coursework overlapped with my topic, so it ended up working out well.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, be optimistic for your advisor relationship. I have a really wonderful relationship with my thesis advisor, Jim Sparrow, in the history department, but folks can also be really busy. So try and get support from elsewhere. I suggest grad students. I was also lucky and had really phenomenal preceptors, one of whom studied Chicago schools, and then the other of whom studied my time period. So I got really lucky, but if there's a grad student who does something similar, oftentimes they're much more available to help, and they can, you know, give more advice in a way that, you know, chairs of departments or something might not have the time for. So yeah, both of my thesis advisors were in the history department, which was great because I feel like the historical part of my paper is really strong, but I wasn't able to find anyone in religious studies. And you know, I had to do the thesis for religious studies, so I don't regret that I did it, but I don't think that's a strong part of the paper because I just couldn't find anyone to advise me. So yeah, I guess that's like a little bit, maybe a little bit of a wording, like consider your strengths and your advisor's strengths, and then don't be afraid to look outside the professional or like the official advising system to find people to help.
Yeah, I think in terms of faculty mentorship, it's really a time to exercise your professionalism and your proactivity, because like people have said, like faculty members are busy. And so it's a time to really like schedule the meetings, get them on the book, like send confirming emails, we're gonna meet at this time. Because as Olivia said, like people will meet their quotas, they're really busy, and I think having a positive and professional relationship with your advisor can be really, really fruitful, but you gotta put in the legwork.
Any other questions from the audience? All right. Thank you so much to all four of our authors for coming back. I really can't encourage folks enough to take advantage of the availability of these papers, as well as the paper of Eleanor Kerala in the most recent volume of Chicago Studies. If you are interested in taking a look at a paper copy, do come by our offices. We're happy to show it to you. They're also available at the reg. But also they're available online. All of the papers were really, really fascinating and great reads, and fascinating, if you didn't get that impression already, very intersectional ways of looking at the city and the kind of work that it does. I mentioned in response to the last question, Anna's question, Chicago Studies did recently do an analysis of the last 4 or 5 years of BA theses, and we've collected them into kind of a visualization that is interactive and that allows you to pick any topic and see who advised it, as well as other papers that are related to it, which then allows you to network to other faculty. We also have a large faculty advisory board that we're always happy to put you in touch with, just if you want to talk to somebody who does think about the city and find a way to connect with them a little bit more personally, if we can make an introduction, we're happy to do that. Likewise, we have a pretty good network of community partners, some of whom came up today. I'm always happy to hear shout outs for the Newberry and so on. So if there's any ways that we can be of support or help, we would love to assist. We are going to be doing a session with one of our partners, Stacy Williams, who until recently was the head of digital scholarship at the Red, now is the head of special collections at Chicago Public Library. She and Joanna Russ, who is a senior archivist with the Chicago Public Library, are going to be walking people through their collections in about a week's time. Tess, am I right? A week from Friday, maybe? They're going to be doing that session as kind of a lunchtime workshop, walking through some of the amazing material that's available in those archives. But that is just scratching the surface. So many more places to explore and so many more partners to learn from and with. Thank you to all 4 of you for joining us today and helping us to learn from and with you.